Hello friends and welcome. Welcome to the third video for this week, and it's on a light topic, grief. So let's get started. Hope you have your water with you or whatever you're drinking with you as you listen to this. If you have the Word document. I will say that the title of this is The Church and the World, Sharing Our Grief. And I could have gone a lot further in depth with grief, but I didn't because several reasons. One is because there's only so much you can say, and then further conversation needs to happen. There are books written about this, of course. And two is because last year I did a sermon series for 6 weeks on grief. And so I shared a lot of what I'm going to be thinking about and talking about there. So this is just kind of like a reminder note of, oh yeah, grief needs to be part of DLUC 2.0, or we need to really consider grief as we think about our future. I get more into that as we get forward, but I just want to say that there's a lot more to say about grief, but this is just a starting step, or just a reminder of where we've already talked about. So, if you have the document open, The Church and the World, Sharing Our Grief. We are naturally inclined to avoid grief. I personally struggle with the feeling of grief because for me it is the ultimate powerless emotion. We have lost someone or something. What can we do to fix it? But grief is not about doing, it's about being and experiencing the feeling. Last fall in 2020, I did a very long sermon series on grief and dying. For some, it was way too long, but my attention to grief is because as a society, we do not do well with grief. We want to jump over grief and enter into the, quote, move on phase of things, whatever that might look like. But this is extremely unhealthy. Grief is natural and good. It is part of the shadow side of life, but we are not called to avoid the darkness as Christians. We are called to walk through it. And I cite Psalm 23, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. We experience grief on a personal level most of the time. When we lose a loved one, we hold funerals so that those who cherish the deceased can come together and grieve as a group. But these services only last for a few hours, and within days, everyone or majority of people return to their routines, except for the ones who are most close to the deceased. For them, grief stays with them for some time and affects people, each person, differently. Some it will last for a few weeks, months, and some for the rest of their lives. There are times, however, we experience grief collectively. As a society, we grieve when horrific disasters occur that affects many groups of people. The scale of such disasters and its impact on society differs based on the context, time, location, and affected individuals, etc. When a society grieves together, it also only lasts short term, whereas the more long-standing affects the grief, where even when society grieves together, it only lasts for a short term, whereas the more long-standing effects of grief hit us on a personal level. In Judaism, some worship services invite those who are grieving to stand during a section of the prayers so that the entire body can pray for those who are grieving. Shiva occurs for the first 7 days after the death occurs. I'm going to mispronounce these other two. Shaloshim lasts for 30 more days. If someone loses a parent, they do honor Avelut for 11 months. I'm totally mispronouncing that one. For 11 months. This beautiful act of recognizing how personal grief can be held by a collective. And so I just really value that tradition, that ritual of the Jewish faith. The difficulty with the grief that I'm addressing here at Deer Lake United is because it's not the death of a person, but the death of a way of being. Some agree with changing the way of being. Others resist this or resist the direction that the change directs. If we all are not on the same page about what has been lost, how can we grieve together? Yet, the ability to grieve together as a church is a tremendous spiritual gift, and it will serve and has served us well as we look ahead. Gone are the times that we can cling to the ways of being that will last for decades. Beyond the staples of church life, aka those 7 categories we explored in previous weeks, most specific activities will be lucky to last for more than 5 years. We need not change as rapidly as the world, for that speed is too intense even for us as individuals, but we do need to stay within a relatable distance from the world. This means that we do not get so stuck in our ways that the world and the church can no longer relate to one another because they are living in different ages. I wonder if the personal difficulties I have with grief is related to the difficulty Deer Lake United has with it. Grief is not about doing something, it's about feeling something. Deer Lake United's main mode of existence is doing. What needs to be done, and usually felt in some sense of urgency. Yet grief is something that actually makes us stop entirely. It forces our world to be questioned and re-examined. Many of you know that I love Sven Brickman's definition of grief as being, quote, homeless love. He wrote, grief hurts. It is a meaningful pain, one that informs the entire network of emotional relationships that constitute the basic psychological substance of our lives. It is through grief that we maintain our bonds with the dead. Grief is the price we pay for love. And this was in his 2018 book. He pointed out that, quote, grief tells us that we can never completely master life. We are forever doomed to fall short due to our dependency on others who vanish from our lives. Grief is not just a simple pain to be cured, like a headache, but a meaningful experience following a loss. The goal is not to erase grief, to move on and leave the dead behind, but to continue living with them. Brickman focuses on death of loved ones, whereas I'm using his work more broadly to experience all types of loss. So how do we continue to live with a past that is no more? That is the question of grief, and it is not an actionable item to do, but an emotional task to be felt, to live with. This very study, DLUC 2.0, has been one of getting us to stop doing and start being with one another in a new way. By reflecting together, not with an outcome in mind, but just because we are exploring and conversing about what's important in and of itself. Just as we hold the conversations we are participating in, we can hold the grief communally. It is very easy to act out in unhealthy ways as we avoid grief. If we don't want to go, or quote, we don't want to go there, we don't want to hear the negative talk, end quote. We distract ourselves. We have low patience and understandings with each other. We try to control things that are beyond our control. Yet avoiding the grief is not helping anyone. It is essential that we learn to walk with grief in our midst so that we can continue living. Here's the secret about sharing grief communally. It requires vulnerability. It requires shedding tears with each other, or perhaps more vividly in biblical terms, tearing of garments. It requires sharing the pain and the hurt of acknowledging what was is no more. It requires our hearts and souls to be seen and thereby risk being hurt even more. If vulnerability in general is a cornerstone of being the church, and it is, then grief can be a beneficial experience for the church as a collective because it exists in the vulnerable states of being. There is power in grief, but it's not the same powerful feeling we get when we do something. The power of grief is to transform the very being of those grieving, and that transformation can lead to deeper, more meaningful relationships and experiences as we continue to live with the dead. Perhaps we should have a funeral for Deer Lake United. We could write on a paper or some object all the things that brought us joy from the past, such as Lifeline Society or Dixon House, or beloved church members who have passed away. We could write on paper some object all the things that have saddened us about Deer Lake United, and we could name them in this service of remembrance. We could let them go from ourselves and to give them to God. Letting go is not forgetting. Letting go is claiming the freedom to continue on. We all do not have to agree on what needs to be relinquished at this moment, but we do all have to acknowledge at the very least that what once was Deer Lake United cannot be anymore, and that means experiencing and embracing grief. So the reflection questions. What needs to be grieved at Deer Lake United? What positive things need to be grieved, and what negative things need to be grieved? 2. How do you grieve? What does grief look like for you? How do you accept and embrace grief while at the same time continuing on in life? What is your relationship to grief? And the last question. What could acknowledging grief at Deer Lake United look like? Do you like the idea of a funeral? What other rituals could we do to honor our past without dwelling there? All right, friends, I hope you go vulnerable places with this conversation about what needs to be let go and what needs to be reconsidered and so forth. Where does grief play in our lives? With that said, this is going to be the second to last, so next week is the last week. I hope we don't end in grief, but you'll have to tune in next week to find out where we take this and where we go from here. All right. See you Thursday for in-person or Zoom conversation, or see you next week in these videos. All right. Bye-bye.